my name is Allison Gilmore, and I will be talking about From the Prison of Slavery to the Slavery of Prison, a text written by Angela Davis. So there are many historical links between black people in prison, but it all stems from the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist, yet by inference allows its continuance as punishment for crime after due process of law. Due to this loophole, there were very many legal ways to make black people slaves again, through tenant farming, sharecropping, peonage, and convict leasing. But I want to focus on convict leasing, seeing as it even carries on in today. Convict leasing set a precedent for privatized prisons to make prisoners manufacture goods for companies. It began in Mississippi in the late 1860s, and it was an effort to control black people in a post-emancipation era. What it literally did was lease convict labor to private companies. Prisoners were building railroads, levees, or they were any private labor or employment. What convict leasing actually did was undermine legal equality, harden racial stereotypes, and intimidate free workers. But for all this to begin, first black people had to become criminals. So black codes were first made in the South, and there were very loose laws that made such things as vagrancy, breach of contract, absence of work, possession of a firearm, even insulting gestures or acts illegal. In fact, in Mississippi, they had something called a pig law, and any theft of swine or cattle would land you up to 5 years in prison. So due to these loose laws, black men were going to jail for very minor offenses with white men who had committed very heinous crimes. In some states, black people were sent straight to labor camps as their white counterparts were sent to penitentiaries. So this carries on into today. Statistics show that in 1997, 1.8 million people were in prisons, and half of those men were black. This illustrates how, by criminalizing black people over 100 years ago, it'll carry on in today. So one thing that also carried throughout history was slavery. So slavery was able to manifest itself through convict leasing. So during slavery, masters had to make sure that their slaves were being well fed to work, and if a slave were to die, in fact, that slave master would lose money. With convict leasing, you didn't have to worry about that convict dying and losing profit. It was actually more profitable for a convict to die because then you could have more convicts to work for your company. Even in 1911, the National Prison Association admitted to the links between the prison system and slavery. And I quote, "The status of the convict is that of one in penal servitude, the last surviving vestige of the old slave system, with its sanctions in the common law, its regulation in the acts of legislatures, and its implied recognition in the Constitution of the United States. It continues unchallenged and without question as a basic institution supposedly necessary to the continued stability of our social structure." So white figureheads at that time knew what they were doing, and they knew that slavery would be needed to keep the economy stable. So women were even subjected to such as cruel things as their male counterparts were. They were whipped nude in the presence of their male convicts. So there's a story of a 19-year-old Negro named Lizzie Boatwright, and she was sent to prison for larceny, and she was whipped twice by white guards. And she was also whipped with another woman in front of all the male convicts because they stopped on the middle of the road to bind their sore feet. So this shows how black women have been dehumanized from the very early times of the 1860s. So what were figureheads in the black community doing at the time? Frederick Douglass, which is supposed to be one of the most prominent leaders of the black community, did not actually speak on convict leasing, and this was for two reasons. One being that he had loyalties to the Republican Party, and another being that he had principles of enlightenment, and those principles would interfere with convict leasing and peonage. He only denounced peonage once he visited South Carolina and realized how little he had known about the true conditions of black people. The second reason as to why Frederick Douglass didn't speak on convict leasing was because there were other issues going on at the time. Frederick Douglass was very outspoken on lynching and also on getting black people the right to vote. His argument is that slavery is not abolished until the black man has a ballot, believing that the ballot was an engine of progress for African Americans. There was one prominent leader at the time. His name was D.E. Tobias, and he spoke out often on convict leasing. Tobias once wrote, "Ex-slaveholders were determined that the Negro should be held in bondage to serve them. Accordingly, the remarkable and ingenious scheme of making the Negroes prisoners was soon devised, and at one score and thousands of ex-slaves were arrested and convicted on any sort of flimsy charges. By reason of this new form of slavery, hundreds and thousands of black men and women had never known that they were emancipated." So Tobias was clearly not silent on the issue. So why is it that we give so much credit to Frederick Douglass when he didn't have time to speak on this issue at all? So with all this being said, convict leasing was just a legal form of slavery that unfortunately has carried on to today. So I currently challenge Americans, what will we do about the mass incarceration of black men?